Welcome everybody to today's panel. Today we are covering Forging a Future, Understanding Nonprofit Finances. So excited to dive into this topic with our panelists today. You are attending a panel by NX Unite by Nexus Marketing, which is a community resource designed to foster connections and facilitate lasting relationships within the mission-driven sector. You can find industry events, suggested influencers to follow, trusted solutions, and cause-driven podcasts on the NX Unite website. And then we also have events like the one that you're attending today, panels, webinars, demos, and other events that you can tune into as well. Today, our panel will be about 45 minutes, and we'll have time for questions that we've prepared in advance, as well as questions from our audience. So if you have any burning nonprofit financial questions, which I know that you do, go ahead and send those in the chat so we can make sure that Jen and Ian and Karen get a chance to speak to those. And then if you have any technical difficulties during the panel, don't worry, we'll get those handled. My team member Anton is in the chat under the NX Unite team username, and if you would just reach out to him there, he'll do his best to assist. And then we also are recording this panel, so if you are attending right now, you'll get a recording sent straight to you afterward, as well as you can access this recording and other panel recordings at any time in the event recording library on the NX Unite community platform. And then before I dive into introductions, I just want to say thanks for attending today's panel and for all the good work that you nonprofit professionals do for the world. So yeah, just thanks for taking the time out of your busy day to join us and to learn. And so without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce our panelists today. First, we have, Ian Pershad, who's the lead finance consultant at HSO.
Hey everyone, happy to be here.
Having provided services for multiple nonprofit organizations, he's well-versed in the cross-section of nonprofit finances, operations, and technology. So thanks for joining, Ian. We also have Jen Blasey, who's a manager at Your Part-Time Controller.
Hi everyone, great to be here.
Jen is a nonprofit accounting professional with a broad range of experience in audit, forensic accounting, consulting, and nonprofit accounting leadership. Thank you for joining today, Jen. And then we also have Karen Houghton, who's the CEO and founder at Infinite Giving.
Hey, everyone.
Karen leverages her deep nonprofit expertise to bring modern cash management to nonprofit organizations all over the U.S. She advocates for organizational sustainability through better financial management, strategic access to curated investment practices, and increased stock, crypto, and DApp giving. So Karen, Jen, and Ian, excited to have all of you here. And without further ado, we will dive into our first question, which Karen, I'll start with you. What key financial metrics should nonprofits monitor to ensure financial health and sustainability?
I'm sure my esteemed colleagues here will all have several different points, but I think the two that I come back to a lot is your operating reserve ratio and just your revenue diversity. So we're going to talk about operating reserve ratio. That measures the available funds compared to your monthly operating expenses. And that tells us essentially how long the nonprofit can sustain operations without new revenue. So nonprofits with operating reserves covering roughly 6 to 12 months of expenses are considered more financially stable. We're not all there, right? Everybody starts in a scarcity mindset. So there's a huge variety of folks, I'm sure, even on this call. One of the things that we hear a lot is that Pre-COVID, it would be 3 to 6 months of operational reserves. Post-COVID, it is now 6 to 12 months of operational reserves. A lot of that is simply because some of us felt it for the first time of saying, oh, this is why, this is best practices, this is where we should have that. And even breaking down those operating reserve ratio with like, hey, this is your operational reserves, having capital reserves, and just forecasting and planning for those unexpected expenses, which sometimes we actually can plan for. So that operating reserve ratio. And the other one is just revenue diversity, making sure that we track a variety of funding sources to ensure stability and really reduce dependency on a single source of income. So it's just about trying not to chase like that same donor over and over again, or how do we kind of grow that? And that can look a lot of different ways, right? But I think a big piece is often looking at, are you just asking for cash on your website? If you do receive stocks, like, are you asking for them? Like, how are you pursuing that? Are you aware of the tax efficiencies and the benefits for donors, and making sure that it's just as easy and as frictionless as possible for donors to give to you in a variety of ways that really meets their needs.
Thanks, Karen. Jen, what key financial metrics are you thinking about for nonprofits to monitor to ensure financial health and sustainability?
Great question. Karen, loved your answers. I actually like the revenue diversity one. That's really interesting. My main focus for metrics is typically cash, similar to Karen's advice. Specific to nonprofits, really focusing your metrics on unrestricted cash in your numerators is really important, right? That's really the cash you have available to spend. And unless a funder or grantor has written it into their agreement that you have to keep restricted funds into a separate bank account, in practicality, most nonprofits have a bank account that they pay their bills from, and that's an operating account that kind of commingles those restricted and unrestricted funds, which is okay, but you really need to make sure that you're tracking and calculating that balance of how much is unrestricted, how much is restricted. It's really important to be doing that throughout the year, monthly if you can. If you wait till the end of the year, you could really have a problem if you have overspent donor restricted funding. So I always like to recommend, make sure any metrics you're looking at is basing it on your unrestricted funds. Similar to what Karen talked about with operating reserves, we like to look at days or months of available unrestricted cash that you have on hand. How many months or days of your operating expenses can you fund? And so you look at your average, I like to use actual year-to-date average expenses that you've actually incurred. If you're really early in the year, you could use your budgeted average operating expenses to really figure out how much runway do you have to be able to fund yourself. And keeping an eye on that over time, right? Cash is a point in time. So if you get a huge gift tomorrow, your ratio suddenly improves. So you really want to make sure you're looking at this over time. Is it the time of year you expect it to be in the position it is, right? If you're seasonal, maybe you expect lower ratios in the off season, in the peak season, when your programming's happening, when you're expecting donations, you want to be looking at that throughout the year, as well as maybe benchmarking against your peers. So looking at days or months cash on hand, hopefully it's months on hand, not days on hand, and then making sure you can take action for that. Looking at like a quick ratio is also a great thing to see, you know, your current assets compared to your current liabilities. Can you meet your upcoming obligations? Those are really my go-tos for looking at metrics.
If I can jump in too, like when you're looking at unrestricted, I think that's, especially if we got a lot of finance people on here, this may be a little bit more for the development team, but always looking at, sometimes we kind of back ourselves into a corner of getting restricted funds, right? So I think the more looking at the ways you're asking for those funds, how is your donation page set up? Are you requiring them to allocate designations, or you can just say, hey, areas where this is needed most? I think sometimes we can find a better balance of incurring those unrestricted donations and having those come in, which gives us more flexibility and the ability to actually kind of grow that reserve fund. That's kind of that first cornerstone of sustainability. That was a great point, Jen.
Thanks, Karen and Jen, on those insights. Ian, would love to hear kind of how you're thinking about the financial metrics that are important for nonprofits to monitor.
For sure. I think Karen and Jennifer made great points. I think there are avenues to look at it in a more, daily operations and micro lens. So, in just outside of the overall operating cash, making sure you're tracking at the program level of your initiatives of your nonprofit. So, if you're allocating expenses to certain initiatives, right, that the revenue coming in, say that restricted funding, though, you're also tracking the cost with that, that program and initiative. And also if there is general overhead, for the nonprofit itself, making sure that's allocated to track against that. I think there's also, within more daily operations, making sure you're tracking your fundraising efficiency and, your donor retention, right? So making sure you have that stable flow of, revenue.
Thanks, Ian. So for our next question, this is going to be kind of a follow-up on what Karen, particularly what you were calling out earlier with the emergency operating budget. So Jen, I'll start with you on this one. How can nonprofits approach budgeting to accommodate growth and unforeseen financial changes? And then any tips on how to allocate resources effectively?
Sure. I'm sure we could all spend the whole day talking about this. I think, a lot of nonprofits don't have the resources or luxury to spend a lot of time or as much time as they want in preparing their budget. So I think one of the key things I like to talk about is your budget is going to be your budget, your benchmark. It's a point in time based on the best information you have available. I like to really encourage organizations to forecast the rest of the year, right? That's kind of fine-tuning your budget, updating your budget. It's really important to understand what's in your budget, right? So that you can explain it and adjust and pivot when there are changes. So you want to understand the probability of achieving your development budget, the timing that is surrounding the development budget, right? So if the funds aren't going to come in when you expected, what are you prepared to do to pivot and adjust? What expenses can you cut? Are there expenses that you will only incur if you secure funding, right? So really understanding what's in your budget. I think it's also important to budget down to cash. So not just thinking about revenue and expenses, what that will look like and trying to make them balance, really understanding what your budget is going to do to your cash. So are you going to be collecting receivables from the prior year because you had multi-year gifts that were revenue in the prior year? How does that impact this year's budget? So it's really a fluid process. Budgeting and forecasts really go hand in hand. Scenario planning is very important, right? Having that plan of what are we going to do if certain targets aren't met? I think it's also important to break your budget down by month. That really can highlight for you areas of shortfalls, especially if you're seasonal or if all your funding, you're being told by your development team is going to come in the last quarter. How are you going to fund yourselves? Can you get to that annual budget? It's really important to be looking at your budget on a monthly basis.
Thanks, Jen. And just a follow-up on kind of the scenario planning that you mentioned. I think you mentioned an example of like, if you don't get to XYZ goal, is that like, are there other examples of scenario planning that kind of nonprofits maybe should keep in the back of their head?
Sure. Not to make more work for everyone, but it really would be important to do like a best case scenario budget, a worst case scenario budget, and a realistic budget so that you have in mind what the different options are, what it can look like. So with donor and fundraising, we often look at probability, right? I'm going to apply for these grants. What's the probability I'm going to get this amount? What does that look like? Things like that would be, our best case development, our best case earned. What's our worst case if we're fully staffed with no vacancies? Those kind of things that you can easily toggle or, put a different number in and see how that impacts your budget. So it's kind of doing multiple budgets instead of just one budget that really factors in some of those assumptions.
Yeah, thanks for expounding on that and not to make more work for everyone, but I thought that might be helpful. Ian, would love to hear kind of how you're thinking about nonprofits approaching budgeting to accommodate growth and unforeseen financial changes, and then how we can allocate resources effectively.
I think Jennifer hit the nail on the head with forecasting. It's forecasting. I think with that, right, you have the ability to monitor and adjust throughout the year. And then again, with that, making sure, if possible, you have the technology and tools to do that, right? So, where that resourcing and that budgeting becomes efficient, right? So if you're spending too much time on the budget, maybe then it almost becomes stale, right? So making sure, you're up to date, monitoring and adjusting that. I think also in terms of unforeseen growth, it's if there is a way you can kind of think, more macro globally, say you're rolling out initiatives that have far reaching impact is that there's infrastructure with that you can kind of expect and replicate and, know the costs and accommodate for as you roll it out.
Thanks, Ian. Karen, would love to hear your thoughts on budgeting approaches for kind of things that we may not expect, and then allocation tips.
I think Jennifer and Ian and I are all very like-minded. I would have mentioned scenario planning, right? The multiple budget scenarios, best case, worst case, most likely case, because that allows us to prepare for various financial incomes. So you've now heard all three of us say that. So clearly it's something that's really important to us. And then of course, like they said as well, just being agile and having those regular reviews. You can conduct monthly or quarterly budget reviews. It allows you to just kind of adjust and react and allocate differently. To provide an extra nugget into that, I think both of those are what lead to the importance of reserve funds, rainy day funds, contingency funds, right? So that if you happen to have that worst case scenario, that's why it's there, right? That one grant that you were so sure you were going to get doesn't come through, or gets delayed, or a donor who's given every year for 10 years doesn't provide the same gift size that they have. That happens to all of us at some point, right? And so I think that's where, when you have that worst case, reserve funds are there, right? It's meant to be accessible. It's meant to be liquid. And so then you can pull it, but then you need to have a plan where, hey, we pull reserve funds. Let's also make sure that when we do take them, because that's what they're there for, that we also have a plan to place that money back in and kind of refund that rainy day fund. So it's always there and available as needed. And then to take that one step further is to ensure good stewardship of those funds and make sure, where are they? Are they just sitting in your checking? Are they in a low cost money market? I talked to somebody the other day and they're like, we're in a money market, but it's 1.2. And I was like, if it's not making 5% in this market, like that's not good, right? I think there's a lot of low risk, high liquid holdings, like some mutual funds, sweep programs, for further FDIC coverage, short-term treasuries. There are things that are low risk, high liquidity that can kind of help you say, hey, we're going to get out of our bank account, potentially make it safer, get some nice yields, but then it's still very liquid, so that if you need it, boom, there it is. CDs don't always have the liquidity. I personally think too many nonprofits rely on CDs without having that natural liquidity and kind of taking on risk, which in previous markets was really good. In this current market may not be the best holdings. So just always thinking about, how are you planning for the worst case scenario? And then also on the other side of that coin, the best case scenario, as Ian alluded to as well, it's like, great, if we forecasted this and we've done this scenario planning, when we have excess funds, we should know exactly where we want to allocate it as an organization, right? It's like, hey, we don't have reserves, or we pulled reserves, we bottomed down last year, or hey, we have 4 months, but we'd love to be at 6 months. Great. Anything that comes above and over, we can start to allocate here. And that planning is what helps us get to financially sustainable organizations, right? Way too often we talk to organizations as investment advisors for nonprofits, is we'll come alongside and they're like, yeah, that one time we got $1.5 million grant, and then now their reserves are at 100K like 4 years later, right? And it's one of those things that they didn't do proper allocation and planning, and they didn't kind of put those guardrails into place. So they had this big impact, but then now they're still in a scarcity mindset month to month and in a place of not having sustainability and peace of mind, which kind of limits their impact, right? Which is the greater intent that we all have. So contingency funds, scenario planning, regular reviews.
I wanted to, if I can, just quickly expand upon something, Karen, you just mentioned, which I think is really important, is, if you have the luxury of having these operating reserves that you can touch, planning ahead, right? You can't just, how do we meet payroll next week and pull, right? There may be some planning involved with, do you know how to access those funds? Does your finance committee have to approve them, right? Does your board have to approve a draw? Do you have a mechanism in place that you can plan for if you need to quickly pull together the board treasurer, the finance committee, whatever it is, to make those approvals so that you can draw? So that does require some planning. And as Karen mentioned, are your funds accessible? Are they able to draw? How much lead time do you actually need to be able to pull them if they're invested in the market versus a CD or things like that? All very important. And if you don't have the luxury of having operating funds that you can pull from, do you have access to a line of credit? So if you don't have one, it's very important. Start now, get one, even if you never use it. Obviously need board approval, finance committee approval, but think through these worst case scenarios. How are you going to fund yourselves? Do you have board member donors that you can ask to accelerate their gifts if you don't have access to a line of credit or operating reserves? So thinking through, how do we get through the year if we don't have, X, Y, and Z in place?
And everyone can plan and back themselves into healthy reserves, right? And I'm not saying it's easy, and I know so many of us are not there. But when you're financially planning, right, it's like, okay, well, this year our goal is to try to raise an extra 10%, and maybe we hold on launching another new program so we don't get ahead of our skis and just say we're going to start to slowly allocate. And then once we have X amount, then we can start to launch new programs. So I think there are ways that I always say, be hopeful if you're not there, and just start to make a plan on how we can slowly and incrementally build you to a place where you want to be.
Thanks, Karen and Jen. And Karen, I think that 10% extra this year is a super helpful example for kind of like an action item for moving forward on that. Well, we're about to transition into audience Q&A. I know we've had a lot of good questions come in the chat, and we still have more time for that. So feel free to keep sending in those questions. But this next question, Karen, I'll start with you because this is really kind of following up to what you were talking about, funding diversity earlier. If you could speak a little bit more to innovative approaches nonprofits can use to diversify their revenue streams and lessen reliance on traditional funding sources.
Yeah, if you are not currently and easily accepting stock donations, DAF grants, considering endowments, potentially cryptocurrency, I know they're not always all for everybody, but I think that's usually a pretty low-hanging fruit of saying, hey, somebody in your circle has some of these assets. It greatly benefits the donor because of the tax efficiencies, and that you should be able to kind of meet the donors where they are and give them the best way to donate and support your mission and organization in a way that also benefits them. Too often, we've done a lot of data and research with high capacity donors, and they turn and just go to larger organizations because they're like, well, yeah, I'd love to get this gift. I need this tax efficiency, but XYZ org direct in my community is too small. They don't know how to do it. They don't have the infrastructure to handle it. And there are partners out there who can make it very easy. Infinite Giving is one of them. A shout out to our company. So I'm biased there, but it is one of those things that is that low hanging fruit where like, hey, if you want to invest a little bit of time, you can have partners who are like, great, here's the infrastructure. We're going to give you everything you need to be able to tap into those larger asset gifts. And or if you're already doing it, there are easier, more streamlined ways that'll free up more time. I also think you all probably know this, but recurring donations and having that sustainable kind of predictable income coming in for monthly. I know in my husband and I's personal philanthropy, we do a lot of monthly giving just because we know how impactful that can be for an organization rather than the less predictable kind of one time. So make sure that you are building up and encouraging recurring donations. I love social enterprises. I know that's not also for everybody, but like launching businesses that can align with a nonprofit's mission to generate earned income and provide steady and predictable revenue is really important. Memberships, associations, things like that, and or, like coffee and different things like that. I think it is possible. And probably the last thing I'd mention is perhaps considering an endowment. I think too often small to mid-sized organizations discount endowments. That's for higher ed, that's for huge hospitals, that's not even applicable to us. But when you look at donors, high capacity donors love the idea of legacy giving, the idea of being able to give a gift one time that can give for decades to come. And the way endowments were mostly created and meant to serve organizations even 10, 20 years ago are very different than they are now. And so, yes, there's true restricted, funds. We do a lot of those, but we actually focus on a lot of quasi unrestricted endowments, which really is that second, right? If you don't have reserve funds and someone wants to do an endowment, I'm usually like, hey, that's a great vision. Let's start here and maybe we can work towards that. So it's not for everybody, but I think once you have a nice reserve fund, another kind of second step that we usually enter into with our clients is, hey, is it worth talking about seeding a quasi endowment for the organization? That means it's organizationally created, not donor created. You can still fundraise into it, right? You can pull off a disbursement, but ultimately, a little bit oversimplifying, but it gives you the means that usually we write this agreement in a way that says, hey, down the road, under extraordinary circumstances, the needs of the organization change, you can actually tap back into those funds as long as they're used to move the mission of the organization forward. So quasi endowments are like this increasingly popular kind of avenue that can provide a nice, steady kind of disbursement and gives the organization a little bit more flexibility and can really tap into large donor giving.
Thanks, Karen. Ian, I would love to hear you speak to innovative approaches nonprofits can use to diversify revenue streams and lessen reliance on traditional fundraising sources.
For sure. I think in general, it's more so just not relying on that one source, right? So say that one big grant, say from a certain organization, it's making sure you do your research across the board, even at the local, state, or federal level in terms of, a grant. I think making sure you're looking at still some traditional fundraising in terms of events or programs there, you can't knock. I think, but again, it's like Karen said, if you can generate recurring, revenue and income, that's the winner, right? So having that steady flow, again, goes back to being able to plan accordingly and again, sustain multi-year, initiatives. I think also, in this day and age, you can't knock social media, right? So if you have, that digital platform, making sure you have that up and running, as long as you have, say, that content out there, that drives the mission, garners attention, people could easily donate just from seeing, a little link on social media or something, right? So making sure you're still, putting the effort across those traditional sources, I think can also, go a long way.
I was just going to chime in. I mean, so many great ideas. A lot has been covered. I would also suggest, take a look at what your peer organizations are doing and organizations with similar missions, right? You need ideas from somewhere. So somebody have something creative that they're doing. Take a look at their revenue composition, right? You can look at audits if they're publicly available or 990s to see what is their breakout, right? If you're doing something similar, how are they getting funding? Is it government, private, foundation? Is it earned revenue? Think about ideas. How can you maybe get some money from the public to charge for your services, even if it's still donor subsidized? Maybe you can be creative that way. A lot of times nonprofit, it's all about relationships, who right? So it's board building, marketing, networking, partnering with other organizations to really expand your networks to get that visibility, because everyone's competing for many of the same dollars. So a lot of that is really relationship driven.
Yeah, definitely. I'd like to just add to Jennifer's point with relationships. If you can have those corporate sponsorships or partnerships, those will go a really long way. And also, there's a lot of large corporations with, CSR programs, that can help out and again, provide, different types of help.
Thanks, Ian and Jen. Gonna transition now to our audience Q&A. And we had a question earlier about software. And I was just kind of going to ask Ian if you could expound on this a little bit about, as people are thinking about, kind of their nonprofit's financial, software and tech, are there kind of some things that you would recommend nonprofits look for as they're thinking about like financial software and tech to put in place, like maybe just considerations as they're going into that decision-making process?
Yeah, I'm going to sound a little biased here for just what I've used for different clients, but I think definitely just moving away from traditional Excel, definitely goes a long way. So using a CRM tool to track your fundraising and your incoming revenue. And then also just with the cloud-based ecosystem we have on the technology side, where you can, have your CRM integrate to your, financial software, whether that be an ERP or, what kind of accounting ledger system you use, that'll go a long way, right? So you can have this very up-to-date, free-flowing technology ecosystem that also, going back to budgeting, that can also live within, say, if you go with a larger technology solution, such as an ERP, that budgeting and forecasting, all of that can also take place. And there's, using something like Microsoft Dynamics, you can also track that down to that programmatic level. So, if you are part of one of those large organizations that have, multiple initiatives and multiple programs going on, you can definitely, use a large technology stack to accommodate that.
Thanks, Ian. Karen and Jen, anything else to add kind of about the tech side of financial management?
Sure. Ian made a great point, like get away from Excel, right? Excel was a good starting point, but we shouldn't still be doing our budgets and financials in Excel. There are a lot of different options for accounting software systems and bill pay and everything. It really comes down to first look at what is your output? What do you need out of a system? And then figure out which system is the right one to give it to you. If you're not going to use all the bells and whistles of some of the more expensive accounting softwares, you may not need it, right? So think first about who are you reporting to? What does it need to look like? Do you need to track restricted grants, the spending of it? Or are you more of a, receivables, payables type of organization? Moving to anything automated and integrated is definitely important. So think about your bill pay systems, right? Can they integrate with your accounting system to reduce anything manual that you're working on? So system integrations are important. There is so much technology out there right now, and a lot of organizations that can help you with this. So I don't know how many organizations I've worked with where they're using what they're using because that's what somebody who worked there years ago knew, and that's what they've stuck with, and nobody has the time to invest in a change. And so that's really where it might be important to reach out to consultants or peers or board members to find out what are other organizations of a similar size, scope, mission using, and would that work for us, and what's that investment? That's where consultants can really come in and help as well, looking at the bigger picture, best practices to see what like organizations are using, your technology consultants, your accounting consultants, your fundraising consultants, about the best way to track your data, whether it's accounting, fundraising, program metrics, all that great stuff. I'm not going to endorse any particular one. It's really going to be specific to your organization, but there's a lot out there. And if you're not currently using something that's budget friendly, data friendly, talk to an advisor to start that process now, because you can save a lot of time internally by becoming more efficient with the electronic bill pays and all the cool stuff that's out there, especially credit card stuff. That's like a headache for every organization, is tracking down those credit card receipts and reporting on it. There's a lot of cool tech platforms out there now that can really make it simpler.
Yeah. And, on more of the cash management side, I think something we see a lot is that nonprofits open up too many bank accounts, right? So it's like, hey, we're sensitive to the 250K FDIC coverage, right? Which is good. That's best practices. So then what they're doing is they're opening up, 3, 4, 5, 6+ different bank accounts just so they can spread that out. And then you're creating all of this work. So when these guys are talking about efficiency, I think it's in automation of bill pay and all of that, but also how are you managing the funds you have and where are they going? And we touched on it earlier. It's like, hey, if you need your reserve funds, how do you get them? Like, where are they? What's that process? So even somebody like Infinite Giving, right? We have a cash vault account where we provide FDIC coverage for nonprofits up to $5 million and almost 4% simply on a cash holding. You link your operating bank account when you need it. You click transfer. It's transferred into your account via ACH in 1 to 2 business days. And so that starts to align where it's like, all right, you've got your operating account, and then you have all of your reserves, your endowments, any of your holdings in another account. You can name them. They can have different allocations. And so for us, we get a lot of like, that just saved so much time. You streamlined everything. I can have all this in one place. And so think about how you're allocating those funds. It's not only about yields and things like that, but also creating those efficiencies and transparency. So nothing's kind of like, oh yeah, we forgot about that account, Or we also have all of these, which name is on that one, who has access to that? So I think some of that low hanging fruit is a great opportunity to kind of streamline and save time.
Thanks, Karen. For our next question from the audience, someone mentioned that their nonprofit juggles multiple fiscal years. They report January to December, but a top donor runs on the Japanese fiscal year, which is April to March, and another from November to October. So they ask, might it be better for us to shift our primary revenue source calendar, and how is this typically handled by multinational entities like ours? So Jen, I was wondering if I could start with you for this question.
Sure. That's a great question. I know this takes some thought before jumping the gun to doing it. I think it goes back to if you're budgeting on a budget by month, forecasting every month, reporting monthly, looking at your data monthly, you can stay on top of this. You can easily report from your accounting system on a different track because you're tracking it all monthly real time. If you're not doing that, it's much harder to try to report on some of these different grant timelines. The government grants always have a different timeline. So it's really important to make sure you have your internal process set up to be reporting on a monthly basis, even if you're doing a soft close and not, factoring maybe, your everyday, accruals that you do at the end of the year, things like that. Some organizations I know have changed their fiscal year ends. That's, again, another big decision, could require a special audit for that stub year. If it makes sense to do, you could align your fiscal year end differently as another thought. But I think just making sure your reporting internally is set up to accommodate the timeframes you need to report on is like the most important step to first focus on before making any major changes. If you are working with your development team and your program team about when the funds come in, you could certainly see from a higher level, when do what is your revenue plan? I know we work with a lot of organizations where we talk to them. If you have your board members with an annual give or get, try to get that early in the fiscal year. It might take a year or two to get everyone aligned, but get that money early, right? That's often your unrestricted, your operating funds that can help fund you. If your funding comes in late in your fiscal year, what can you do to accelerate those funds? Do you add a special event early in the year? Do you add your fundraising appeals earlier in the year? But you do want to look and look at the timing of your revenue coming in, because you've got payroll every week, every 2 weeks, every month, whatever it is. You've got certain expenses that are always going to need to be paid on a certain cycle. So matching your revenue and cash the best you can is very important.
Thanks, Jen. I want to make sure that we're getting to as many audience questions as possible. So for this next one, Ian, if you could take this one. But someone asked about, they receive in-kind donations and pro bono donations, but aren't sure if that's considered revenue. And if so, what does that reporting look like? So also, it seems like this organization gets a lot of donations from local businesses that want to donate materials and labor. So just kind of, if you have any insights on how that should be recorded, and maybe kind of what that might look like, leveraging your tech stack for those donations as well.
Yeah, I don't know if you necessarily call it true revenue. Jennifer and Karen might be able to jump in on that. But in kind or contribution in kind, I think with the correct tech stack, you're able to tag different items coming in. So that might be a way to go about that. So yeah, I think again, if there's just that way to track it on the way in, whether it be that true manual labor, and then I think also being able to determine, say, like a cost or a value associated with that labor, is part of that process also.
Thanks, Ian. For the next question, this is kind of a follow-up, Jennifer, on you were talking earlier about kind of like cash budgeting, but someone asked about, can you please discuss the pros and cons of zero-based budgeting? If you'd start with this one, Jennifer.
Sure. I feel like it's a pressure that some people have about needing to present their board with a balanced budget and needing to figure out, how to do that. And often the pressure goes to the development team, right? Here's our gap. This is how much more you have to raise. I just want to touch on, having a balance or having a budget that's not balanced is not necessarily a terrible thing, as long as you can understand why the budget is not balanced. So a lot of it is the financial storytelling behind it, right? If I'm going to go and submit a deficit budget to my board, can I explain why? There can definitely be valid reasons why you have a deficit budget. And one of the main ones that comes to mind is, say, in the current year, prior to your budgeted year, you got significant multi-year gifts, right? A lot of times non-financial people, including board members or executive directors, may not understand that all that revenue typically would go into the current year. So all 5 years of revenue hits in the current year, which means next year you don't have that revenue, you don't have 1/5 of that revenue coming forward, which looks like you've got an unbalanced budget, especially if there's expenses that go along with that revenue. And so some of it could be timing. So you want to focus on, if I have a deficit budget, how am I funding that budget, right? So I've got receivables from last year that are going to be collected in the current year that are going to fund this budget from a cash basis, right? So you want to connect the dots between your balance sheet and your income statement, or your statement of financial position, your statement of activities in the nonprofit language. You want to be able to connect those dots to how these financials actually connect. You also have to factor in restricted giving, right? So sometimes organizations only present an unrestricted budget, and they don't factor in the restrictions that are going to be released over to, fund in the unrestricted, or they don't think about how your total P&L and budget is going to look at audit time when you have all the pieces together. So I would caution not to stress too much about presenting a balanced budget. Obviously, that's ideal, but there can definitely be valid reasons why you may not have a balanced budget. You need to really think about the whole picture and what's happening, because your budget is for a point in time for that particular fiscal year. And over the long term, you might be in really good shape because you have all these multi-year gifts committed to help fund you beyond the budget year.
Thanks, Jennifer. I think for our final question for today, someone asked about any annual nonprofit finance focused conferences that might be good to know about. Karen, I was wondering if you have any that you would recommend.
I saw that question and I was like, I kind of want to know that too. And there's one that I was thinking about, and I know it happens like in the New England area. And I was kind of hoping you wouldn't ask me because I can't think of the name right off. And I want to do a side note to Mary in the chat, because she is answering a lot of these great questions. She's giving good advice too. So Mary, maybe Nexus needs to have you on one of their panels. Thanks for jumping in so much. But I don't know, Ian and Jennifer, how would you answer that? Do you guys know of some really good conferences? And I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the only one that I know, but I know it's kind of small.
Yeah, I can jump in here real quick. The AICPA often has a nonprofit annual conference. They also do a lot of webinars online. Your state CPA society often does too. So I'm in Pennsylvania, so the PICPA has a lot of nonprofit conferences and resources. Plug my own firm, your part-time controller. We have online database webinars, resources that are free that you can go to. So there's definitely a lot out there. Sometimes just a quick search can help find that. But I would start with your state society or your the national CPA, societies.
Yeah, and then for me, I work with HSO, and so we're a large Microsoft partner firm. And so they do things through the Microsoft Tech for Social Impact group, and there's other organizations such as That Hope that do put on large conferences and kind of envisioning initiatives around how technology can improve your nonprofit operations.
It was a good question. So many are like focused around the development of nonprofits and kind of fundraising and things like that. So I love the finance focused question.
Thanks, everyone. And we're getting to the end of time, and sincere apologies to everyone we weren't able to get to your questions. And again, shout out to Mary. Thanks for jumping in the chat, and also appreciate everyone being really active in the chat today and sending in your questions. Anton is going to send out a quick survey in the chat where if weren't able to get to your questions, you can send those in via the survey and we can connect you to the panelists afterward, or we'll also be adding everyone's LinkedIns in the chat as well, so you can reach out to folks folks there after the panel. But as we're kind of wrapping up, I just want to give our panelists a chance to share how you can connect with them afterward and get in touch with their organization. So Ian, would you kick us off?
Sure. Yeah. So again, my LinkedIn will be in the chat. You could email me directly at Pershad, Pershad at hso.com. And then I'll also, I think I could post a link in the chat about, some of the offerings we have on the nonprofit sector. So I'll definitely put that in the chat as well.
Thanks, Ian. Karen?
Yeah, Karen at infinitegiving.com. We are a registered investment advisor that works specifically with nonprofits. So just put our link in there. Happy to email and help as needed.
Thanks, Karen. And Jen?
Sure. So similarly, you could connect with me on LinkedIn. Emailing, you could connect with my firm at hello@yptc.com, or go on our website, which is, yptc.com. I can also throw that in the chat. Happy to help answer any other questions offline.
Awesome. Well, Karen, Jennifer, and Ian, really appreciate y'all sharing all of your expertise and answering these great questions from our audience today. So thanks for taking the time to join us today. And then to everyone who joined for the panel, just also appreciate y'all being here. I hope everybody has a great rest of their day, and just good luck with all of your nonprofit financial management. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.